When Seneca faced his most vicious critics in the Roman Senate, men who accused him of hypocrisy, greed, and manipulating the young Emperor Nero, he responded with a calmness that infuriated his accusers more than any angry defense could have. His secret wasn't thick skin or emotional numbness. It was a profound understanding that criticism reveals more about the critic than the criticized, and that our response to criticism determines whether it becomes a tool for growth or a weapon for destruction. If you're ready to transform your relationship with criticism from defensive reaction to wise response, consider subscribing to this channel where we explore ancient wisdom for modern challenges. Most of us navigate criticism like wounded animals, immediately defensive, emotionally reactive, and focused primarily on protecting our self-image rather than extracting whatever value might exist within the critique. We've been conditioned to view criticism as attack, feedback as judgment, and disagreement as personal rejection. This conditioning transforms every critique into a potential threat to our self-worth, creating cycles of defensiveness that prevent learning and damage relationships. But what if criticism could become one of your most powerful tools for growth? What if the very thing that currently triggers your worst emotional reactions could be transformed into a pathway toward wisdom, resilience, and genuine self-improvement? This isn't about developing thicker skin or learning to ignore criticism. It's about developing the psychological sophistication to extract value from criticism while maintaining your emotional equilibrium and core sense of worth. Seneca understood that criticism is inevitable for anyone who attempts anything significant. He wrote, "The man who does anything noteworthy will have all kinds of people talking about him. Those who live boldly, create meaningful work, or stand for important principles will attract both praise and condemnation." The quality of your life isn't determined by whether you receive criticism. It's determined by how skillfully you respond to it. The first principle Seneca taught about handling criticism involves what we might call philosophical triage, immediately categorizing criticism into 3 distinct types that require completely different responses. The first type is legitimate criticism that contains accurate observations about genuine flaws or mistakes. The second type is illegitimate criticism based on misunderstanding, incomplete information, or malicious intent. The third type is mixed criticism that contains elements of truth wrapped within unfair characterizations or delivered through problematic methods. Most people respond to all criticism as though it belongs to the second category, treating every critique as an attack to be deflected rather than information to be evaluated. This defensive stance prevents us from benefiting from legitimate criticism while simultaneously making us more vulnerable to illegitimate criticism by creating emotional reactivity that clouds our judgment. Seneca practiced what he called objective evaluation, examining criticism with the same dispassionate analysis he would apply to any other form of information. When accused of accumulating wealth while preaching philosophical principles of simplicity, he didn't immediately defend himself or attack his accusers. Instead, he examined whether the criticism contained valid points about potential inconsistencies between his teachings and his lifestyle. This examination led him to write some of his most profound letters about the relationship between philosophy and practical life, acknowledging that he was indeed wealthy while clarifying how he understood the role of external goods in a philosopher's life. His response transformed criticism into an opportunity for deeper self-understanding and clearer public communication of his actual positions. The process of objective evaluation begins with what Seneca called the pause of wisdom, a deliberate delay between receiving criticism and responding to it. During this pause, you examine the criticism for accuracy without simultaneously defending against it. You ask, is there truth in this observation? Does this criticism identify something I've been blind to in my own behavior? Could this feedback help me become more effective or more aligned with my values? This pause serves multiple purposes. First, it prevents you from responding defensively before you've actually understood what's being said. Second, it allows your initial emotional reaction to settle so that you can think more clearly about the substance of the criticism. Third, it demonstrates to others that you take feedback seriously rather than dismissing it reflexively. But the pause of wisdom isn't just about timing. It's about approaching criticism with what Seneca called philosophical curiosity, rather than emotional defensiveness. Philosophical curiosity involves genuine interest in understanding different perspectives, even when those perspectives challenge your current beliefs or behaviors. It means asking questions like, "Help me understand what you observed that led to this conclusion," rather than making statements like, "You're wrong about me." The second principle involves understanding what Seneca called the mirror effect, the recognition that criticism often reveals as much about the critic as about the person being criticized. People criticize from their own psychological frameworks, value systems, and life experiences. What one person sees as confident leadership, another might interpret as arrogance. What one person views as healthy boundaries, another might characterize as coldness or selfishness. Understanding the mirror effect prevents you from taking criticism too personally while helping you extract whatever legitimate insights might exist within biased or poorly delivered feedback. When someone criticizes your communication style as too direct, you can ask whether their feedback points to ways you might communicate more effectively while recognizing that their preference for indirect communication might reflect their own discomfort with clarity rather than an objective flaw in your approach. This understanding also helps you respond to criticism with appropriate emotional calibration. Legitimate criticism from people whose judgment you respect and who have observed your behavior carefully deserves serious consideration and potentially significant changes in your approach. Criticism from people who barely know you or who have demonstrated poor judgment in other areas deserves polite acknowledgement but shouldn't carry the same weight in your self-evaluation. The third principle Seneca emphasized involves what he called virtue-based evaluation, measuring criticism against your core values and long-term character goals rather than against your immediate emotional comfort or short-term reputation management. This means asking whether accepting and acting on particular criticism would make you more virtuous, wise, courageous, just, or temperate, rather than asking whether the criticism feels fair or whether the critic has the right to offer it. Sometimes legitimate criticism comes from unexpected sources. Seneca noted that even enemies can sometimes provide valuable insights that friends might be too polite to offer. A business rival might accurately identify weaknesses in your strategy that your team has been reluctant to mention. A former colleague who dislikes you personally might still offer valid observations about habits that limit your effectiveness. Virtue-based evaluation allows you to benefit from accurate criticism regardless of its source or motivation. If someone points out that you consistently interrupt others during meetings, the fact that they might be trying to embarrass you doesn't make their observation less accurate or less useful. Your response should be based on whether the criticism helps you become more aligned with your values, in this case, respect and consideration for others, rather than on whether you like or trust the person offering the feedback. This approach requires what Seneca called ego transcendence, the ability to separate your sense of self-worth from your current level of skill, knowledge, or behavioral consistency. When your identity is rooted in your commitment to growth rather than your current level of achievement, criticism becomes information rather than threat. You can acknowledge mistakes, skill gaps, or behavioral patterns that need improvement without experiencing those acknowledgments as attacks on your fundamental worth as a person. The fourth principle involves what Seneca termed the gratitude transformation, a counterintuitive practice of finding genuine appreciation for criticism, even when it's delivered poorly or mixed with unfair characterizations. This isn't about pretending to enjoy being criticized or developing masochistic tendencies toward negative feedback. It's about recognizing that criticism, when handled skillfully, provides opportunities for growth that we might not create for ourselves. Seneca wrote, "The willing, destiny guides them. The unwilling, destiny drags them." We can approach criticism as unwilling victims being dragged through an unpleasant experience, or we can approach it as willing students being guided toward greater wisdom and effectiveness. The external experience might be identical, but our internal experience and the outcomes we generate will be dramatically different. Consider how rarely we receive honest feedback about our blind spots, habits, or impact on others. Most people in our lives are too polite, too busy, or too conflict-averse to offer direct observations about ways we might improve. Our friends love us too much to hurt our feelings. Our colleagues are too focused on managing their own relationships to risk awkward conversations about our developmental areas. Our family members might see our patterns clearly but have given up trying to change us. Critics, even hostile ones, are often willing to point out things that others see but won't mention. When someone criticizes your tendency to dominate conversations, they might be expressing what multiple people have noticed but haven't had the courage or interest to address directly. The criticism provides information that could help you become more socially effective, even if the critic's motivation isn't to help you improve. The gratitude transformation involves thanking critics sincerely, even when their delivery is poor or their motivation is questionable. Seneca practiced saying, "Thank you for taking the time to share your perspective," and meaning it, regardless of how the criticism was delivered. This response often diffuses hostility while demonstrating emotional maturity that can transform adversarial relationships into respectful exchanges. But gratitude for criticism goes deeper than social strategy. When you can genuinely appreciate feedback as a gift, regardless of how it's wrapped, you develop what psychologists now call growth mindset. Instead of viewing criticism as evidence that you're flawed or inadequate, you begin to see it as evidence that you're engaged in challenging, meaningful work that creates opportunities for development. The fifth principle addresses what Seneca called strategic response, choosing your reaction to criticism based on what will serve your long-term goals rather than what will provide immediate emotional satisfaction. This involves distinguishing between criticism that deserves public response and criticism that's better addressed through private reflection and behavior change. Seneca often chose not to respond publicly to criticism, especially when he determined that public defense would create more drama than resolution. He understood that some criticism is best answered through improved actions rather than clever words. When critics accused him of being too theoretical in his philosophy, he responded by writing more practically applicable letters rather than by arguing about the accusation itself. Strategic response also involves choosing the timing and format of your response. Immediate responses to criticism are often defensive and emotional, even when you're trying to be rational. Seneca practiced waiting at least 24 hours before responding to significant criticism, allowing his emotional reaction to settle while he considered the most constructive way to address whatever legitimate points might exist within the critique. When you do choose to respond to criticism, Seneca advocated for what he called generous interpretation, assuming the best possible motivation for the criticism and responding to the strongest version of the critic's argument rather than the weakest. This approach often transforms adversarial exchanges into productive conversations while demonstrating intellectual honesty that increases your credibility with observers. For example, if someone criticizes your decision-making process as too slow, you might respond by saying, "I appreciate you pointing out that my thoroughness might sometimes delay important decisions. Help me understand which specific situations would benefit from faster action, so I can calibrate my approach more effectively." This response acknowledges the potential validity of the criticism while gathering more specific information that could actually help you improve. The sixth principle involves what Seneca practiced as reputation sovereignty, maintaining your core sense of identity and worth independently of others' opinions while remaining appropriately responsive to legitimate feedback. This requires understanding the difference between reputation and character, between image and reality, between what others think about you and who you actually are. Seneca wrote extensively about the futility of trying to control others' opinions while emphasizing the importance of deserving a good reputation through virtuous action. He understood that some people will think poorly of you regardless of how you behave, while others will think well of you even when you don't deserve it. Your energy is better invested in becoming the kind of person who merits respect rather than in trying to convince everyone to respect you. Reputation sovereignty doesn't mean ignoring feedback about how others perceive you. Your reputation affects your ability to influence, lead, and collaborate effectively. If multiple people perceive you as untrustworthy, arrogant, or unreliable, those perceptions will limit your effectiveness regardless of whether they're accurate. The key is addressing reputation problems through genuine behavior change rather than through public relations strategies. When Seneca faced criticism about potential hypocrisy between his wealth and his philosophical teachings, he didn't dismiss the criticism or attack his critics. Instead, he examined whether his lifestyle was actually inconsistent with his stated values and made adjustments where he found legitimate problems. He understood that defending against accurate criticism is ultimately futile because reality has a way of confirming or refuting our reputations over time. The seventh and final principle involves what Seneca called criticism as teacher, systematically learning from the pattern of criticism you receive rather than just responding to individual instances of feedback. Over time, the themes that appear repeatedly in criticism about your behavior, decisions, or communication style reveal important information about your developmental priorities. If multiple people in different contexts criticize your tendency to micromanage, that pattern suggests an area for focused improvement regardless of whether you agree with specific instances of the criticism. If several colleagues mention that you seem distracted during meetings, that feedback points toward habits that might be limiting your effectiveness even if individual observations feel unfair or incomplete. Seneca kept what we might call a criticism journal, regular reflection on the feedback he received, looking for patterns that revealed blind spots or habits that needed attention. He approached this analysis with scientific curiosity rather than emotional defensiveness, treating criticism as data about his impact on others rather than as judgment about his worth as a person. This systematic approach to learning from criticism creates what psychologists call feedback literacy, the capacity to extract value from imperfect information sources while maintaining appropriate emotional boundaries. When you develop feedback literacy, you become less dependent on receiving perfectly delivered criticism from ideally motivated sources, because you can find learning opportunities even in poorly delivered feedback from questionable sources. The integration of these 7 principles creates what we might call criticism resilience, the capacity to maintain your emotional equilibrium, extract valuable insights, and continue growing in wisdom regardless of how criticism is delivered or what motivates those who offer it. This resilience isn't built overnight, and it requires the same kind of patient practice that any complex skill demands. Criticism resilience begins with understanding that your worth as a human being is not determined by your current level of skill, knowledge, or behavioral consistency. You are valuable because you are a conscious being capable of growth, not because you have already achieved some particular standard of excellence. This fundamental shift in self-concept allows you to acknowledge flaws, mistakes, and areas for improvement without experiencing those acknowledgments as threats to your essential identity. When your sense of self is rooted in your capacity for learning rather than your current level of achievement, criticism becomes information rather than attack. You can say, "You're right. I do interrupt people during meetings," without simultaneously thinking, "I'm a terrible person who doesn't deserve respect." The acknowledgement becomes a starting point for behavior change rather than an occasion for self-attack or defensive argumentation. This psychological foundation allows you to approach criticism with what Seneca called philosophical courage, the bravery to see yourself clearly, acknowledge your limitations honestly, and commit to growth even when growth requires admitting that you've been wrong about important things. Philosophical courage is different from physical courage or social courage. It requires facing internal truths that might be more threatening to your ego than external dangers or to your body. The practice of criticism resilience also involves developing what we might call source calibration, the ability to weigh criticism appropriately based on the credibility, motivation, and observational capacity of the person offering it. Not all criticism deserves equal consideration, but determining which criticism merits serious reflection requires wisdom rather than emotional reactivity. Criticism from mentors, close friends, or respected colleagues who have observed your behavior over time typically deserves more consideration than criticism from casual acquaintances or people who clearly have hostile motivations. But even hostile criticism can contain valuable insights, and even well-intentioned criticism can be based on incomplete understanding or poor observation. Seneca developed what he called the Council of Advisors approach, imagining how 3 or 4 people whose judgment he deeply respected would evaluate particular criticism about his behavior. This mental exercise helped him separate his emotional reactions from his analytical assessment, allowing him to consider criticism more objectively without being swayed by either defensive emotions or the social pressure to accept all feedback as valid. The temporal dimension of criticism resilience involves understanding that most criticism is time-sensitive, accurate in some ways during particular periods, but not necessarily permanent truths about your character or capabilities. The criticism you receive as a new leader learning to navigate authority will be different from the criticism you receive as an experienced leader who has developed confidence and skill. The feedback you get while developing new competencies will differ from the feedback you receive when those competencies have matured. This temporal perspective prevents you from treating criticism as though it reveals fixed, unchangeable aspects of your personality. Instead, you can approach criticism as information about your current developmental stage, your present blind spots, or your existing habits, all of which can be modified through conscious effort and practice over time. Seneca regularly revisited criticism he had received months or years earlier, examining how his growth had addressed earlier developmental areas while identifying new areas that required attention. He understood that character development is a lifelong process, and that the criticism you outgrow through successful development creates space for new, more sophisticated feedback about higher-level challenges. The social dimension of criticism resilience involves modeling for others how to handle feedback gracefully while creating psychological safety for honest communication in your relationships and work environments. When you respond to criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness, you encourage others to share their observations more freely, creating opportunities for more accurate self-understanding and more effective collaboration. Many people in your life have observations about your habits, blind spots, or impact that could help you become more effective, but they hesitate to share those observations because they've learned that most people respond to feedback with defensiveness, argument, or emotional distress. When you demonstrate that you can handle criticism constructively, you create an environment where others feel safe offering honest perspectives. This requires what Seneca called emotional leadership, taking responsibility for the emotional climate of difficult conversations rather than expecting others to manage your emotional reactions for you. When someone offers criticism, your initial response sets the tone for whether the conversation becomes a defensive argument or a productive exchange of perspectives. Practical emotional leadership during criticism involves acknowledging the courage it took for someone to offer potentially uncomfortable feedback, asking clarifying questions to ensure you understand their perspective accurately, and thanking them for caring enough about your effectiveness to risk an awkward conversation. These responses encourage honest communication while demonstrating emotional maturity that increases others' respect for your character. But criticism resilience also requires appropriate boundaries, the ability to engage constructively with legitimate feedback while protecting yourself from malicious attacks or manipulative criticism designed to control your behavior rather than help you improve. Not everyone who offers criticism has your best interests at heart, and not every instance of negative feedback deserves serious consideration. Seneca distinguished between generous criticism, offered with genuine concern for your welfare and effectiveness, and strategic criticism, designed to manipulate, control, or undermine your confidence. Generous criticism might be delivered poorly or mixed with emotional reactivity, but it contains legitimate concern for your growth. Strategic criticism might be delivered smoothly and reasonably, but it's motivated by the critic's desire to change your behavior for their benefit rather than yours. Learning to identify this distinction prevents you from becoming either too defensive, rejecting legitimate feedback because it's uncomfortable, or too accommodating, changing your behavior based on manipulative criticism that serves others' agendas rather than your development. The key is examining both the content and the motivation behind criticism while maintaining appropriate skepticism about feedback that seems designed to serve the critic's interests more than your growth. The ultimate goal of developing criticism resilience isn't to become immune to negative feedback or to reach a point where you no longer need to grow and change. The goal is to transform your relationship with criticism from reactive defensiveness to proactive learning, from emotional volatility to philosophical stability, from ego protection to character development. When you master the art of handling criticism according to Seneca's principles, something remarkable happens to your entire approach to personal development and relationship management. You stop waiting for others to validate your worth and start taking responsibility for your own growth. You cease being dependent on praise for self-confidence and stop being devastated by negative feedback. Instead, you develop what Seneca called internal scorecard, the capacity to evaluate your progress based on your alignment with your values rather than others' approval or disapproval. This internal scorecard doesn't make you indifferent to others' perspectives or immune to the social consequences of your choices. Rather, it ensures that external feedback informs your decisions without controlling your self-worth. You can take criticism seriously without taking it personally. You can acknowledge mistakes without experiencing shame about your fundamental adequacy as a human being. The development of this internal stability creates what psychologists now recognize as authentic confidence, confidence based on realistic self-assessment and genuine competence rather than on others' opinions or comparative superiority. Authentic confidence allows you to admit ignorance without feeling stupid, acknowledge mistakes without feeling worthless, and accept criticism without feeling attacked. This transformation affects every aspect of your life because it fundamentally changes how you approach challenges, relationships, and opportunities for growth. When you're no longer primarily motivated by avoiding criticism or seeking approval, you become free to make decisions based on your actual values and long-term goals rather than on managing others' perceptions of you. In professional contexts, this freedom allows you to take appropriate risks, offer honest opinions, and pursue meaningful work even when those choices might attract criticism. You can advocate for important principles without being paralyzed by the possibility that others might disagree with or misunderstand your position. You can accept leadership responsibilities without being overwhelmed by the certainty that leadership decisions will inevitably displease some people. In personal relationships, criticism resilience allows you to have honest conversations about problems rather than avoiding conflict to prevent negative feedback. You can address issues directly when they're small rather than allowing them to grow into larger problems because you're afraid of how others might respond to your concerns. You can maintain appropriate boundaries without being manipulated by others' displeasure or criticism of your choices. The ripple effects of this transformation extend beyond your immediate behavior to influence the culture of the communities and organizations you're part of. When you model how to handle criticism gracefully, you create psychological safety for others to be honest about problems, mistakes, and areas for improvement. This honesty leads to faster problem solving, more effective collaboration, and higher overall performance. But perhaps the most profound transformation involves your relationship with failure itself. When you can extract learning from criticism, you develop what researchers call failure tolerance, the capacity to view setbacks as information rather than as verdicts on your competence or worth. This tolerance allows you to attempt more challenging goals because you're less afraid of the criticism that might result from falling short. Seneca understood that avoiding criticism often means avoiding significance. Those who attempt nothing important rarely face serious criticism, but they also rarely contribute anything meaningful to the world. The willingness to face criticism becomes essential for anyone who wants to create, lead, innovate, or stand for important principles. This willingness doesn't mean seeking criticism or being indifferent to others' legitimate concerns. It means accepting that criticism is the price of engagement with meaningful challenges, and developing skills for handling that criticism constructively rather than being paralyzed by fear of negative feedback. The long-term practice of these principles creates what we might call wisdom acceleration, the capacity to learn faster from experience because you can extract insights from a broader range of feedback sources. When you're not limited to learning only from praise or validation, you can gather information from criticism, failure, conflict, and disagreement. This expanded learning capacity allows you to develop expertise more quickly and adapt to changing circumstances more effectively. Seneca practiced what he called daily criticism review, regularly examining the feedback he had received, both explicit and implicit, and identifying patterns that revealed areas for continued development. He approached this review with scientific curiosity rather than emotional defensiveness, treating criticism as data about his effectiveness rather than as judgment about his character. This systematic approach to learning from criticism creates compound benefits over time. Each piece of feedback you handle constructively makes you slightly more resilient to future criticism while slightly more skilled at extracting value from difficult conversations. The cumulative effect is the development of genuine emotional intelligence and interpersonal effectiveness. But the ultimate benefit of mastering Seneca's approach to criticism isn't personal, it's social. When you respond to criticism with wisdom rather than reactivity, you contribute to creating a culture where honest feedback becomes safe and normal rather than rare and dangerous. You model for others that growth is possible at any age and that feedback is a gift rather than a threat. The world needs more people who can receive criticism gracefully, offer feedback skillfully, and create environments where truth-telling serves growth rather than creating conflict. These skills become increasingly important as our society becomes more diverse and our challenges become more complex, requiring collaboration between people with different perspectives, values, and communication styles. Consider how much human potential is wasted because people are too afraid of criticism to attempt significant challenges, too defensive to learn from mistakes, or too reactive to maintain relationships through disagreement. The principles Seneca taught offer a path toward reclaiming that potential by transforming our relationship with one of life's most common and valuable experiences. As you begin practicing these approaches to criticism, remember that mastery develops gradually through consistent application rather than through dramatic breakthrough moments. Each time you pause before responding defensively to feedback, you're building the neural pathways associated with emotional regulation. Each time you extract learning from poorly delivered criticism, you're developing the cognitive flexibility that serves wisdom. The goal isn't to reach a point where criticism never triggers emotional reactions or where you no longer need feedback for continued growth. The goal is to develop the capacity to maintain your essential stability and continue learning regardless of how criticism is delivered or what motivates those who offer it. If these ideas resonated with you and you want to continue developing your capacity for wisdom in difficult situations, consider subscribing to this channel where we explore how ancient philosophy addresses modern psychological challenges. Share this video with someone who might benefit from transforming their relationship with feedback and criticism. Tomorrow, when you receive your first piece of criticism, whether it's a minor correction, a significant critique, or something in between, you'll have the opportunity to practice these principles. That moment of choice, repeated consistently over time, is how we transform our relationship with difficulty and build lives of genuine resilience and continuous growth. Seneca understood that criticism is one of life's most reliable teachers, but only for those who approach it as students rather than as victims. The techniques we've explored offer a path toward that studentship, toward the kind of wisdom that grows stronger through challenge rather than being diminished by it. The ancient Stoics believed that character development is the most important work any human being can do, and that everything we experience, including and especially criticism, can serve that development when approached with the right mindset and skills. In a world that often treats criticism as attack and feedback as judgment, developing the capacity to learn from difficult conversations becomes both a personal achievement and a contribution to collective wisdom. The principles are straightforward, but they require the same kind of patient, consistent practice that any worthwhile skill demands. They ask nothing more than your willingness to approach criticism as an opportunity for growth rather than as a threat to your worth, and your commitment to becoming the kind of person who can benefit from feedback regardless of how imperfectly it's delivered. This is how we honor both our own potential for growth and others' courage in offering perspectives that might help us become more effective, more wise, and more aligned with our deepest values. This is how criticism becomes a pathway toward virtue rather than an obstacle to peace.